Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we will be reviewing the Alaska del Sur wash processed Ecuador from the Picky Chemist. And there's the bag right there. And the Picky Chemist, based out of Chaudfontaine, Belgium. And they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel on numerous occasions to somewhat mixed feedback, as we've had some coffees from them that I very much enjoyed, but also some pretty far out there ones as well, including the anaerobic processed Costa Rican coffee, and more recently the El Placer, which was a very interesting Colombian coffee. But given that our next European tier list is coming up here in the near future, I knew we needed to revisit the Picky Chemist at least one more time to determine where we wanted to place them on that list. And luckily for me, not only did they release the Gesha Village coffees that everybody raves about, but they also offered their first ever Mejorado coffee in this Alaska del Sur. So I'm definitely looking forward to discussing all three, beginning with this one, as this right here is day 55. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a slightly toned down recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 95 degrees Celsius, about 203 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. But interestingly, I went a little bit more fine on the grind with this one as well. Now, roast profile for this coffee. Interestingly enough, they only released this one as an Omni roast profile. And even then, as I've mentioned with the Picky Chemist in the past, it's still going to be just about as light of a coffee as you could expect from almost any coffee roaster in the entire world, as their Omni roasted coffees are still extremely light by most standards and metrics. Obviously not quite as light as some of their filter offerings, but even then, this is still an extremely light coffee. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 28, first impression, and we did opt for the V60. And you know what, I'm actually going to stop right there because I feel like, interestingly enough, the day 28 starting point for us is pretty standard, because I don't think that the Picky Chemist necessarily specifies at what point you should start their coffees other than the post 2-week mark, although a lot of people I know didn't even necessarily start it this early. But day 28 is a general rule of thumb for a coffee that we know is extremely light, and we kind of want to start it because, as Brian Kwan has also mentioned in some of his videos, we really want to pick this coffee at its best when it starts to peak, so we want to see this coffee transition, and that's why we started it a little early. But let's go back to that day 28 mark, as it had a little bit more intensity than we might have expected for this coffee, given a combination of factors. One, that it is a Picky Chemist coffee and it is very light, but two, that it is a Mejorado coffee, and usually with Mejorado coffees we don't necessarily get the most intensity right from the onset. Usually it does take a little bit of tinkering to get maybe a little bit more out of the coffees. But outside of that, there's plenty of the listed toffee Mejorado brown candy sweetness in the cup. And what's really funny to me is that they do have the toffee note listed here on it. And when I saw that, I'm like, yeah, I'm definitely going to be experiencing plenty of that Mejorado characteristic within this one. And that was definitely present. Plenty of texture while still offering that classic, the Picky Chemist lightness. So a lot of positives I took away from this first impression. Day 31. Through the Chemex, and this is a bit more of the expected results for this coffee, as it's notably lighter this time around with a little less intensity. There's a little bit more of that Mejorado listed toffee sweetness in the finish, but the majority of the cup continues to remain a little bit more tame with some softer floral aspects as well. Day 34 through the April brewer, and it's between the first two impressions, as it does have a lot more of that Mejorado-like intensity with a strong level of that toffee-like sweetness to it. But at the same time, a little bit more of the citric qualities in the cup with a soft yet pronounced sweeter floral tone in the finish. Clean, light, and sweet, and that's a really nice positive for me, as those are three things that I very much look for in coffee. Day 37 through the V60 with some slightly lower temperatures, and once again, this is where things got pretty interesting, because for the most part, as I've said in the past, when it comes to Mejorado coffees, I found better success kind of toning down the coffee in general. But once again, since this is a super light coffee, a lot of people would probably go the opposite direction. I heard a lot of people say that they really wanted to push this one, and I think the best way to kind of describe it is maybe tuning a guitar, where it feels like you're supposed to tune it up, you're supposed to kind of tighten the string, but the reality is you're actually supposed to loosen the string. And I think that's kind of what happened with this coffee right here, because a lot of people will continue to try to see what more they could get from this coffee, and that's actually something I'm going to discuss as well within this review. But I decided to go the opposite direction. I kind of wanted to see what would happen if we went the opposite direction, and it was reminiscent of our initial impression. So I think right off the bat, I could tell that I had a preference towards the V60 with this coffee. This time it has a little bit more of the listed violet and some semi-sweet citric aspects. There's a little bit more of that strong toffee brown candy sweetness and a slight herbal aspect, but a very nice day yet again. And last year we did review a different Alaska del Sur coffee, that one being from George Howell. And what I noticed from that coffee was a fair bit of this kind of spiced quality to it. I think that they had something along the lines of a wintergreen listed on there. And I could feel shades of that within this coffee as well. And that's what I'm going to be alluding to when we discuss that herbal tone within this coffee as well. Day 40, through the Chemist with the same adjustments, and it's the best it's been to this point, offering a very high level of sweetness in that toffee brown candy sense, with the secondary characteristic being a floral and more citric tone to it. It's been mostly consistent as of this moment. Granted, we have made very slight adjustments to this coffee, with the only big notable adjustment being toning down the temperatures ever so slightly. Day 43 through the V60 with the earlier adjustments, and this was a little bit more tame. Slightly less sweetness with a bit more focus on the herbal and floral qualities of the cup, and a subtle citric quality, but an overall similar profile to the cup. Day 46 through the Chemist with the same adjustments, and it is up there a little bit in terms of the sweetness, offering a little bit more of that in terms of the notable brown candy-like intensity, with a bit more citrus this time around. And interestingly enough, we did get a message from somebody around this time where they said that they were getting better results from this coffee when they were really pushing the extraction. So I said, okay, here's what I'm going to do. And I actually lowered the doses of this coffee, and I didn't take notes on this, mostly because it was an experiment that I wanted to try on my own. So I went the opposite direction, and I took 13 grams of this coffee and I played around with it in a couple of ways. So first, I did go a little bit more fine on the grind, and I did really go high on the temperatures, and I went higher on the ratio, and I wanted to see what would happen. And I felt like I was losing a little bit of the intensity and the finish to this coffee, and I was feeling a little bit more of that kind of brighter tone to the coffee, a little bit more, I would say, just clarity in general. But for the most part, I was losing a little bit of the sweetness that I had experienced otherwise. And that seems to be consistent with the majority of Mejorado coffees we've had in the past. So that was the first thing I tried. And I said, okay, why don't we try it even more? And then I pushed it a little bit more and took another 13 grams and went even more fine and more intense on this coffee to see if maybe that would change it. But I was continuing to get similar results, as I felt like it was one of two things. Either this coffee is honestly not ready to be consumed here, even on this day 46 mark, or that I was finding better results from toning this coffee down, which again is consistent with my Mejorado results from the past. So it's one of those two things. Regardless, on day 46, we went that direction, and I just found some niceness to it from having this coffee a little bit more toned down. And that would be replicated once again on day 50, as we opted for the V60 with slightly lower temperatures and a little bit more fine of a grind. So we kind of found this middle ground to it, and it was the best that it had been to this point. So that's why we opted for those slightly higher than we had initially toned it down to temperatures, but at the same time going a little bit more fine on that grind. And at this time, it built upon the citric qualities with a slightly sweeter orange tone, some softer red berries reminiscent of pomegranate, and a sweeter stone fruit reminiscent of apricots. Otherwise, a little bit more of that herbal tone, as I kind of mentioned, that slight wintergreen-like quality, and that very strong toffee base reminiscent of Mejorado coffees. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have one level 5, so let's go through that one real quick, and that is the sweetness level 5. And let me start with this. This is the sweetest of the wash processed coffees that we've had from the Picky Chemist by a notable distance, as I think a lot of the issues I've had with their wash processed coffees in the past have been that they are a little bit more tame and a little bit more toned down than I would like, specifically in regards to the sweetness. And it does take me back to the Rwandan coffee that we had reviewed from them, which on paper was supposed to be a pretty sweet coffee, but I really struggled to get a lot of sweetness out of it upon the initial impression that we had, which was a little sweeter, but towards the end I just continued to struggle to get more of the sweeter profiles from this coffee. This one was the exception though. It was sweet right from the onset, but throughout the entirety of it, I wouldn't necessarily say that it continued to own that same level of very strong sweetness. It's a level 5 once again. Relative to the majority of wash processed coffees, it's significantly sweeter than them, but when you kind of compare it alongside Mejorado coffees, I've definitely had sweeter wash processed Mejorado coffees, but this one still does justify itself at that level 5 mark. Let's go through the rest of the level 4s. We will start actually with the finish level 4. And the finish is interesting because not only does it offer that toffee-like brown candy finish to it as well, but it has that slight herbal tone that I continuously mention, and that became a little bit more prominent as we continued to adjust this coffee and it continued to open up a little bit more day by day. Florality, level 4. And I think a lot of the notes that they have listed on this coffee are on the more floral side of things. And I think what I've experienced from these Mejorado coffees is that when you go lighter on the profile of them, I continuously get more of the floral tones to them. Whereas oftentimes when you can maybe develop them a little bit more, I can experience a little bit more of the robust kind of brown candy aspects and even a little bit more of the fruit tones. But that's why the florals are the level 4 and none of the fruit qualities within this one do reach anything above the level 3 mark. Caramel level 4, I don't think I really need to explain that one. The list of toffee that they have on here, very prominent, very pronounced, very sweet. It definitely gave this coffee a fair bit of sweetness to it. All right, let's go through the level 3s. We will start with the acidity level 3. And that also continues to remain a consistent theme with a lot of Mejorado coffees that we've had. I've said in the past that I like to kind of use the level 4 for what you'd experience from a Kenyan coffee in terms of brightness as the benchmark for that level 4 acidity. So it wasn't quite there. There was a little bit of brightness to it. I should say there was notable brightness to it, but not to that extent. So level 3 felt the best place to put that. Berry fruit, level 3. Mentioned briefly some slight red berries, a little reminiscent of pomegranates. Citrus fruit, level 3. I think that they have some sort of orange quality list on here, maybe like an orange blossom, but I could definitely see a little bit more of a sweeter orange tone to this coffee as well. Stone fruit, level 3. Even mentioned a slight bit of an apricot-like aspect, which is something I've also experienced from other Mejorado coffees as well. None of them prominent enough, at least relative to the florality or the toffee within this coffee, to justify them reaching that same level as those notes. Body level 3, which is also a pretty interesting one because that's also been an interesting tone theme when it comes to Mejorado coffees, as they don't necessarily always offer the most amount of body. But this one right here, a little bit more medium bodied, which had a little bit more texture to it. Kind of an interesting aspect for me. And then the final thing worth discussing is the cleanliness at a level 4. And I continue to say this about extremely light profiled Mejorado coffees. They just seem to have a little bit more clarity to them. They seem to be void of maybe some of the aspects that take away from the Mejorado being a super clean varietal. Although obviously it's a very clean varietal, I just have to say that it seems like they're void of any of the extras. Like if you kind of look at this tasting wheel, no bitterness, no smokiness. I mean, the saltiness and the savoriness are both relatively toned down compared to the majority of Mejorado coffees that we have that are maybe a little bit more developed. But yeah, that's kind of the biggest thing I had to discuss about this coffee, because I think the cleanliness is an important factor when you take in regard to the overall roasted profile of this coffee. So that's an interesting part. But as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. This one is by far my favorite wash processed coffee that we've ever had from the Picky Chemist. And I don't think that'll come as a surprise to anybody, given that not only have I had somewhat mixed responses and opinions of the washed coffees we've had from them in the past, this one is also the most intense, but it's also the one that's most in line with my own preferences. As going into this coffee, well, going into the Picky Chemist's release of these coffees, I was dead set on getting this coffee because I knew that if there was one coffee, a washed coffee from the Picky Chemist that I was going to enjoy, it was going to be this one right here, and that did live up to those expectations. I can say that this coffee lived up to the expectations that I had for it going into it. I would say, if anything, it actually slightly exceeded those expectations, mostly because it did have what I was looking for in this coffee, most specifically the sweetness and the clarity, both of which in notable abundance. But outside of that, it had a nice bit of depth to it. And honestly, I feel like the best of this coffee is still yet to come. And I feel like a lot of people that either were working on this coffee or are going to work through this coffee are probably going to get better results from this one, because they probably were a little bit more patient and waited a little longer on it, because I feel like this coffee might still open up. And I do have a little bit to experiment with this coffee, because as you probably heard in this review, I experimented and tinkered with this coffee a little bit more than I would otherwise, mostly because I was a little bit more determined to get better results from this coffee than I have been with most of the coffees in the past, just because of what this coffee is specifically. Even then, I do have to say there are a lot of nice positives to take away from this one right here, and it definitely did raise my impression of this coffee roaster as in regard to their wash process coffees a fair bit. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, obviously the first place I have to start is the profile of this one being super light, so keep that in mind. And I think it does help with the clarity, as I continue to insinuate and harp on when it comes to these profiled sort of coffees, especially in regards to Mejorados. Outside of that, if you do like the Mejorado tones to it, most distinctly and notably that brown candy sweetness, this one has that in notable abundance, as it's definitely the key factor in terms of the overall sweetness, and definitely one of the more prominent and pronounced notes to this coffee. Outside of that, it has really nice depth. You get a nice balance of fruit profiles within it, great florality as well, and a nice bit of texture, giving this coffee just some well-rounded aspects to it in total. That's the best direction I can point somebody towards for this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Alaska del Sur wash processed Ecuador from the Chemist. Thank you for watching.